Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents By the Blood of Heroes by Joseph Nassise, narrated by Shawn Compton. Chapter 1. Trench 479, The Western Front. This God-forsaken place. Captain Michael Madman Burke set aside the trench knife he'd been using to clean the mud out of the clockwork mechanism that powered his left hand, and closed the access panel with a firm push. He'd been at it for almost a half hour, but didn't think he'd done more than move the dirt from one set of gears to another. He knew he'd need a trip to the rear in order to get it properly cleaned. Unfortunately, he wasn't due for another of those for at least 2 more weeks, and was stuck with his own meager efforts for the time being. Such was life in the American Expeditionary Force. His fingers clicked and clanked as he worked them back and forth, testing to see if his field repair would do any good. There was still some resistance in movement, but not as much as before. For that, he guessed he should be thankful. He rolled down the sleeve of his wool uniform shirt and got up from the camp stool he'd been sitting on. A glance at his pocket watch told him it was time to start getting the men up and ready for the morning stand to, as dawn was less than an hour away, and the shamblers wouldn't be far behind. It might be March, but the morning air was far more winter than spring, and Burke knew it would have a nasty bite. He pulled his greatcoat out from beneath the blankets he'd slept under and slipped it on, grateful for the warmth his body had imparted to the material during the night. The extra heat wouldn't last long in the cold morning air, but it would at least ward off the initial chill for a few minutes, and Burke had been a soldier long enough to know that you indulged in the little things while you could. Helmet and rifle in hand, he stepped out of the makeshift tent to find Staff Sergeant Moore waiting for him, just as he had been waiting every morning for the 3 years that they'd been stuck here at the front together. "Morning, Charlie," Burke said. The sergeant gave a noncommittal grunt and handed Burke a tin cup with steam rising off it. The coffee was weak. They'd been using the same grounds for over 10 days now, but Moore had put a generous taste of rum into it, and Burke sighed in satisfaction despite the taste. "What have we got?" he asked. The sergeant shrugged. "Nothing unusual, sir. McGraw's men reported hearing movement beyond the wire around 0300, but the scouts we sent out came back without having encountered anyone. Probably just more of what we've been getting all week, if you ask me." Burke nodded. The enemy had been probing their defenses for 6 days straight. Never anything too serious, just quick little engagements that forced his men to react, revealing their locations and letting the enemy get a sense of what they would be facing if they did come in force. Not if, when, he corrected himself. If there was one constant in this war, it was the enemy's implacable desire for the living. So let them come. His men were more than a match for any German unit, with or without shambler accompaniment. Lord knows they'd had enough practice. The Great War was in its 7th year, but it seemed to Burke that it had been going on forever. He could barely remember what life before it had been like, though he was honest enough with himself to admit that his forgetfulness might have more to do with his own desire to put the past behind him than the length of the conflict. Truth was, after May's death, he just hadn't given a damn anymore. The days flowed past in an endless haze of gray, one after the other, until he wasn't able to tell where one ended and the next began. In the end, he'd enlisted, not out of some misguided sense of duty or vain quest for glory, but simply to try and feel something again. If he couldn't feel alive while staring into the face of death, well, then perhaps he didn't deserve to live anymore. Of course, that had been during the early years, back when a bullet was a bullet and the man you killed with it stayed dead afterward. Once the Germans invented that damned corpse gas, everything changed. The last 3 years had been particularly brutal. While the Allied powers had managed to hang on to the small stretch of ground won at the end of the Somme offensive, it had been by only the thinnest of margins. Even now, the Americans continued to increase their support of the beleaguered French and British armies, sending fresh troops to fill the gaps being carved in the Western Front. As the death toll mounted and the ranks of the opposition swelled, reinforcements continued to arrive, Doing anything else could mean certain doom for everything from the English Channel to Moscow. The line had held, but only just. "All right then, Charlie, let's get the men up." The two of them began moving in unison down the length of the trench, waking up each man in turn and ordering him to fall in at the fire step, ready to defend his position if need be. And most mornings, that was exactly what was needed. A mere 200 yards separated the two sides, but that 200 yards of no man's land was composed mostly of bomb craters, minefields, abandoned trenches, and row upon row of barbed wire, making it some of the most treacherous ground on the face of the planet. Recently, the enemy commander opposite them had made it a habit to order dawn assaults on the section of the Allied line that was under Burke's command, which meant Burke had to rouse his troops out of their bedrolls every morning, get them assembled on the raised earthen step that allowed them to see over the top of the trench, and wait in the chill morning air for an attack that might not come. There was a peculiar feeling in the air this morning, a tension that hadn't been there during the past week. Burke had the feeling that the Germans were done testing their lines. An attack was sure to follow, and he sensed that today was the day. As the men scrambled to take their places along the line, Burke had a quiet word with each of them. They were good men, though many of them were relatively untrained, having only recently been sent to the front to replace the losses suffered over the last month. He gave them a few words of encouragement, reminded them that the men on either side of them in the trench depended on their actions, and then left it alone, confident that Sergeant Moore would handle any other needs the men might have. All that was left at that point was to wait to see what the enemy would do. 15 minutes later, the man beside him, a corporal named Ridley, suddenly stiffened. "There's something out there, sir," he whispered. Burke followed the man's frightened gaze out across the muddy battlefield to where the first of the barbed wire emplacements was buried beneath the weight of a thick curtain of fog, but didn't see anything. After a moment, he heard it. The sound of movement, out beyond the wire. It was a sound he'd become intimately familiar with over the last few years, and one he knew he'd hear in his sleep long after the war was over. "Steady," he told the men nearest him, and the command was repeated down the line. Any moment now. The first of the shamblers emerged from the fog on the far side of the barbed wire, lumbering toward them with the peculiar gait for which they'd been named. Behind it came at least a dozen more, though Burke was sure that was just the first wave. They'd once been men, that was easy to see. Some were still dressed in the tattered remnants of the German uniforms that they'd worn while alive, scraps of gray cloth hanging on their desiccated frames. Others were naked, their rotting flesh exposing bone in more than a few places. The control devices they wore stuck out as the only intact thing about them. Dark collars that encircled their necks and rose up on the left side of their faces to cover that side of the head in a mixture of leather and electrical components. But thinking of them as men was a grave mistake, however, for they had ceased being anything remotely human the moment their corpses responded to the call of the corpse gas and rose anew, hungry for the flesh of the living and driven nearly mad from their desire to consume it. The control devices rendered them manageable, but only just. This was fine with the German commanders in charge of the Shambler brigades, for soldiers like these were best used as shock troops anyway, fodder to weaken the Allied lines and pave the way for the human divisions that usually followed in their wake. A rifle went off to his right, then several more, but Burke held his own fire, wanting to be certain of his shot, wanting to make it count. Back in the days before the war, most soldiers were taught to shoot for the center mass, but that didn't do much good anymore. Shamblers were long past the point of feeling injury or pain. You could knock one down with a shot to the middle of its chest and it would simply get back up again. Even blowing off a limb didn't do much good. As long as it could move forward, the shambler would do so, dragging itself forward with its bare hands or wriggling its body along the ground. The only way to stop one was to put a bullet in its brain. Even that wasn't final, Burke thought. Being exposed to the corpse gas would cause the creature to rise once more, which was why his side had taken to burning the bodies of friends and foe alike in giant bonfires after every conflict. The air had become so saturated with the smell of burning flesh that he barely noticed it anymore. Burke had learned through long experience that if you waited until the shamblers got hung up in the barbed wire, you'd have a better chance of making that head shot as they struggled to pull themselves free. He propped the barrel of his weapon on the lip of the trench and used his mechanical hand to hold it steady, sighting in one of the enemy soldiers that was currently squirming its way through a hole in the wire. A moment to steady his breathing, a few extra ounces of pressure on the trigger of the rifle in his hands, and he put a bullet smack in the center of the creature's skull. Without hesitation, he swung the barrel of his rifle to one side, sighted it on another target, and began the process all over again. His men were firing regularly now, the sharp cracks of their rifles and their shouts of hatred for the undead blending together into a mad cacophony of sound. From somewhere farther down the line came the rattling burr of a Hotchkiss machine gun, and he glanced that way, watching with satisfaction as an entire squad of shamblers were cut down in mid-stride. Once on the ground, it was an easy matter for the sharpshooters to finish them off. Just as he'd expected, however, this first group turned out to be just the tip of the enemy's attack. Wave after wave of the ravenous creatures followed, attempting to make their way through the hail of gunfire and reach Burke and his men. Behind them came the German regulars, firing from the safety of the back of the pack and not caring if they accidentally hit some of the shock troops that were trying to clear the way before them. Burke kept up a steady rate of fire, alternating with the man next to him when one or the other of them needed to reload and snatching quick moments of rest in between waves of the assault. Some 2 hours after the attack began, it was finally over. The stretch of no man's land directly in front of them was littered with the still bodies of the enemy dead. Thankfully, none of the shamblers had reached the trench itself. If they had, the outcome would have been very different, Burke knew. He reloaded his rifle for what felt like the 100th time that morning, and then, seeing Sergeant Moore making his way back along the floor of the trench toward him, stepped out to greet him. They were still standing there, chatting quietly and comparing notes on how the new men in the platoon had reacted to the attack, when the ground beneath their feet trembled. "Did you feel that?" Burke asked. Moore nodded. "Felt like an earthquake. We get ones like that back in San Francisco all the time." An earthquake, Burke thought. In God-forsaken France? Before he could express his doubts, the ground trembled again, this time with more force. It shook them about for 30 or 40 seconds and knocked several of his men off their feet. Rats burst out of their holes all along the sides of the trench, swarming around the soldiers' feet before charging en masse down its length. Burke had a moment to stare after them in surprise before the ground began shaking for a third time. The makeshift tent he'd been using as a command post collapsed, as did the stockpile of crates containing ammunition and food stores just beyond. The sides of the trench itself began to shake apart, great clods of dirt breaking free and falling around them so frequently that Burke began to fear that they all might be buried alive before the trembling stopped. He wasn't the only one with the thought, apparently, for he saw several of his men praying aloud or gripping good luck charms as the shaking continued. A young private named Hendricks scrambled up out of the trench, silhouetting himself against the sky, only to take a sniper's bullet through the throat a moment later, his body dead before he hit the ground. Just when Burke thought they wouldn't be able to take any more, the trembling stopped as the trench wall 10 feet in front of him burst open from the inside. Dirt flew in every direction as a strange machine rose into the morning sunlight, the 3 massive drills attached to its snout still spinning wildly as its tracks drove it up out of the earth. As Burke looked on, stunned into immobility by the machine's sudden appearance, hatches clanked open along its length and a horde of shamblers spilled out of its dark interior, falling upon the men of 4th Platoon with a vengeance. In seconds, it was every man for himself, as hand-to-hand combat stretched from one end of the trench to the other. Chapter 2. Toul Aerodrome. 12 miles away from where Captain Burke was fighting against a horde of ravenous undead, Major Jack Freeman stepped out of his tent into the brisk morning, pulling on his thin leather flying gloves as he went. The sun was just breaking through the cloud cover, its feeble light barely visible through the smoke and dust that seemed to be the only constants in this never-ending war. Despite the early hour, the home of the 94th Aero Squadron was anything but quiet. The mechanics had taken the aircraft out of the hangars and had them facing forward down the airfield, where they were being prepped for the dawn patrol. The enlisted men were already up, manning the machine gun pits that were scattered throughout the airfield, ready to protect the Allied aircraft on the ground in case of a German attack. If the enlisted men were up, so too then were the men of the hospital company, ready to drag the wounded to the hospital tents and the dead to the fire pits. The din of men at work filled the air around Freeman. He snorted at himself in disgust at his characterization of the enemy. Germans? How could they even be called that anymore? Each new assault swelled the ranks of the undead, and they had long surpassed the number of living troops left under the German high command. An army of the ravenous dead didn't care about nationalism. All they wanted was their next meal. Freeman had been involved in the war from the very beginning of America's support, when the 94th had been activated at Villeneuve in March of 1918. It seemed like a long time ago now. He jammed the cigarette into his mouth and then removed a battered silver lighter from his pocket. It had been a present from Rickenbacker, back before the invention of the gas, when this war had only been a war and not a struggle for the survival of the human race. He turned the lighter over in his hands and held it up so that he could read the inscription in the thin morning light. "A gentleman and a flyer," it read. Instead of cheering him, the sight of it made the airman shake his head in near despair. Rickenbacker was gone now, and Marr with him. At least they had perished in fires on the ground instead of rising to fight against their own men like so many of the others. Facing off on the air against his longtime friend would have been unthinkable. A glance at the weathometer on his wrist told him it was just after 7, with the air pressure holding steady in the green zone. Another hour and the wind would disperse the clouds enough to fly. Then the real day's work would begin. Might as well use the time to get some breakfast, he thought. The mess hall was set up in the old farmhouse. His squadron mates, Samuels, James, and Walton, were already there, waiting for the day's briefing. Not that today's mission would be any different from the hundreds of others they'd already flown. The aerodrome at Toul was only 12 miles from the front. Nancy lay 15 miles to the east, Lunéville 10 miles beyond that. The highway from Toul to Nancy to Lunéville ran parallel to enemy lines and was within easy shelling distance of their guns, making it difficult for the Allies to move troops and supplies up to the front in support of the men holding the line there. The 94th's job was to patrol that long stretch of highway and do what they could to keep it clear so that the infantry wouldn't be cut off. Freeman joined his men as they were sitting down to a breakfast of synth eggs and ham. They both tasted like paste, making it hard to tell them apart once they were in your mouth, but he was glad to have them. All the men were. Real food was growing scarcer than a pig in Berlin. As happened most every morning, the men in the squadron were discussing the enemy, and the argument went round and round without really getting anywhere. There were far more questions than answers. Why did the shamblers crave human flesh? What caused their ravenous hunger? Why did a small percentage of the dead come back as revenants, their physical dexterity, their mental acuity, and perhaps even more important, their memories, all perfectly intact? Understanding the answers to these and other questions was an issue of the highest priority. Solving them could bring an end to the war, but there was no way this group of farm boys was going to manage that. Freeman kept quiet throughout the discourse, just nodding noncommittally over his coffee, for he had nothing new to share on the topic. After breakfast, while the men were still enjoying their coffee, a runner arrived with news that a wireless call had just come in from Nancy. Several enemy aircraft had been spotted heading in the direction of the aerodrome. "Time to earn our pay, boys," Freeman said as he led the way out of the mess hall and to the field. The entire squadron now flew SPAD 13s, and while Freeman missed his old Newport 28, he had to admit that the SPAD was a nice substitute. Introduced in the fall of 1917, it had a maximum range of 2 hours flying time and a ceiling of just under 22,000 feet. Armed with 2 synchronized Vickers machine guns mounted in front of the pilot, it had quickly become a favorite among the flyers attached to the American Expeditionary Force, AEF. Rickenbacker had flown one until his death, and Freeman had decided to switch to the SPAD in tribute to his old friend. Mitchell, Freeman's mechanic, had the Major's bird in the lead position and wasted no time getting the propeller spinning when Freeman climbed aboard. Being the careful type, Freeman took a few extra moments to be certain everything was in proper condition. He checked the tachometer first, watching it as he opened the throttle and then closed it back down again to an idle, making sure the engine was running normally. His gaze swept over the fuel pump and quantity gauges. Next he moved to the physical controls. Waggling the control column, he tested the aileron and elevator movements, taking them through their full range of movement. The rudder was a bit stiff, but he attributed that to the cold morning air and didn't give it another thought. A quick tap of the finger on the altimeter, a brush of his hands over the petrol cocks and magneto switches, and he was ready to go. Freeman lowered his goggles, made sure that the lenses were adjusted to the same polarization by nudging the selector on either side of the goggles with the tip of his finger, and then gave Mitchell the thumbs up. When the same signal was received from the rest of the pilots manning the aircraft strung out in a line behind Freeman, the mechanic turned to him and swept his arm forward in a wide arc. Freeman advanced the throttle, watching as the propeller's flickering dissolved into a darkened haze. The SPAD came to life, awkward at first as it tentatively moved onto the grassy field. As the engine surged into a throaty roar, the machine picked up speed and its forward motion smoothed out, though the creaking and groaning of the undercarriage didn't cease until the SPAD eased itself off the ground and into the chilly air above. Just a few short minutes later, the entire flight of 4 aircraft was up and headed east, following the roadway. Freeman flew low over the Allied lines, knowing the Jack of Spades painted across the underside of his wings would be visible from his current height to the men on the ground. As America's top ace, he felt it was his duty to encourage the men every chance he could, and the sight of his distinctive plane was sure to give a lift to those in the trenches below. A dark cloud of smoke was already spiraling upward from an area 100 yards behind the Allied positions, the stench of burning flesh wafting through the air along with it, and he steered slightly to the east to get away from the stink of the corpse fires. He couldn't imagine the horror this infantry had to face on a daily basis. How the Germans had gone so horribly wrong in creating that hideous gas was anyone's guess. It was bad enough up in the air, fighting aircraft flown by pilots who were long dead. How much worse it must be to sit there, mere yards from the newly risen opposition forces, knowing that the other side saw you as nothing more than that evening's meal. Once, when he was laid up in the hospital at Reims, he listened to the survivors of the Battle of Soissons recount their experiences. The opposition made assault after assault, charging out of that venomous green gas and through no man's land as fast as their rotting forms could carry them. The long miles of barbed wire became heavy with bodies, and still they came, stepping over the still-moving carcasses of their comrades to rush the trenches, dragging off those Allied soldiers unlucky enough to be near the break in the lines. The Allied troops fell back to the secondary and then the tertiary trenches before the attack had been repelled. While that was bad enough, the descriptions of the Allied dead waking up later the same night in the abandoned trenches and crawling under the wire to assault their former comrades was far worse. Freeman remembered vividly the look on one private's face as he talked about the horror he felt bayoneting the man who he'd just spent the last 45 days huddled within a foxhole, and of his shame at then having to burn the body in the bonfires to keep his friend from rising a second time. Remembering it now made Freeman shudder in his seat. Thank God gas only worked on inert tissue. If it had the same impact on the living as it had on the dead, this war would have been over years ago. As they neared the outskirts of town, Freeman began to climb higher. The possibility of being jumped at so low an altitude by the opposition's pilots outweighed his desire to boost the morale of the soldiers on the ground. The haze was thick, the cloud cover fairly low, and Freeman wanted some clear sky beneath their wings before they were forced to engage the enemy. 15 minutes later, they crossed into enemy territory and ended up getting lucky right away. The observation balloon first appeared as a small dark smudge against the blue-green earth below. Reaching up with one hand, Freeman pushed the magnification lenses into place over the left eye of his goggles and took a good long look at the aircraft ahead of them. The balloon was one of the Keko styles, a long teardrop-shaped cylinder with 3 stabilizing fins. There was a symbol painted on the rear fin, but it was too far away to see clearly with the goggles' current settings. Reaching up with his left hand, he flicked through the magnification selections until the black German cross painted on the dirigible's rudder swam into view. They had the enemy in sight. All they needed now was an attack plan. Freeman had the flight in formation at 6,000 feet with his plane in the lead, followed by Samuels and James flying parallel. Walton brought up the rear, forming an aerial diamond. He didn't give the signal to attack, at least not yet. Instead, he craned his head around from side to side, huddled against the rushing wind, searching the sky below for the fighter cover that he knew had to be present. The opposition never sent the balloons aloft without the fighters. They had to be here. And they were. Both aircraft, Pfalz D-12s by the look of them, were approximately a few hundred feet below and to the south of the balloon, drifting lazily along as though they didn't have a care in the world. Freeman waggled his wings, getting the attention of his fellow pilots. He pointed downward at the balloon and then tapped the side of his head with 2 fingers. He then pointed at the escort aircraft circling below and then at his men. They understood. It would be their job to take on the opposition's aircraft while Freeman went after the balloon. They all circled back around, staying in the cloud cover until they could bring their planes into position with the sun at their backs. Then, as a group, they fell into a rushing power glide, designed to bring them up on the enemy as swiftly as possible. Freeman watched the balloon grow larger and larger in his field of vision, his comrades forgotten as he focused on his attack. He covered more than half the distance to the other craft before its crew noticed his presence. He could see them floating beneath the wide bulk of the balloon in their wicker basket, frantically calling the ground crew on the field phone. Those on the ground were equally desperate, rushing to the mechanical winch in the hopes of getting the balloon and its crew pulled out of the sky before Freeman could reach it. With his Vickers guns thundering in his ears, Freeman closed in. Even in the weak sunlight, he could see the incendiary tracers arcing away from his aircraft and slashing into the fabric of the balloon. Before he got too close, he pushed hard on the stick and banked his Spad, sending it around the edge of the balloon just as a bright arc of color danced along its surface. Seconds later, the sky around him was filled with the glare and heat of an explosion as the gas inside the balloon ignited. He looked back to see the observers jump out of the now falling basket, taking their chances of surviving the fall rather than burning up with their craft. He roared in exultation as he watched the flaming balloon crash to the ground atop the moving forms of the ground crew, trapping them in the blaze. That's 4 more of the bastards that won't rise again, by God. For the first time since he began his dive, Freeman noted the whine and crack of the machine gun bullets coming from the troops below. He pulled back on the stick, taking his Spad up and out of the reach of the weapons that were trying to claim his body for their masters. When he was safely at altitude, he surveyed his chariot, finding a good number of holes in the fabric of his wings and several splinters gouged out of the leather-wrapped wood surrounding his cockpit area, but nothing that would suggest he needed to return to the airfield. Satisfied, Freeman looked down once more. Now only one German biplane occupied the sky, and even he wouldn't be up for long. A thick stream of black smoke was pouring out of the engine, and Samuels was hanging doggedly on the Pfalz's tail, firing as he chased it around the sky. As Freeman watched, the enemy aircraft suddenly collapsed on itself, falling away in pieces to the ground.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?